Everybody, and welcome to a joint presentation by the London Middlesex Branch of Ontario Ancestors and London and Middlesex Historical Society. Tonight we have a presentation titled Undertaking a Review of Death and Funeral Home Records, past and present, Joe O'Neill. So just before we get started, I did have a couple of quick little housekeeping announcements. So just so you know, as attendees, of course, you're unfortunately not be able to heard. There is a Q&A that's available, so if you are not able to see it yet, you just have to open it. There's a window, it should say show Q&A, and you can type questions or comments in there, and Sheila Johnson and myself will be monitoring that and posing those questions to Joe throughout the presentation. So feel free to use that throughout the presentation. We are going to pause throughout the presentation a little bit, so just to kind of get some of those questions in, and Joe will be able to address those. And just so you know, if Joe at some point says, does anybody have any questions or anything, just know there's about a 15 to 20 second delay in us speaking and the attendees hearing it. So just if there's a bit of a short delay, don't think that's weird. We are recording the presentation. So for those that are attendees, you'll be able to actually access that recording afterwards. So if anybody has to drop off for any reason or is having technical problems, you can actually use the link that you used to get into the presentation to actually access the recording afterwards. And finally, there is going to be a brief survey sent out to all the attendees that registered. So just sign your email for that. And we'll get that out to you coming out through SurveyMonkey anyway. I also wanted to mention some upcoming events, other presentations that are going to be done by the London and Middlesex Branch of Ontario Ancestors coming up over the next few months. Our next one is going to be September 12th, and that's going to be Dan Oatman doing a presentation on British home children sharing their stories. October 3rd, we have a presentation by Noelle Farrell Griffin, and that is going to be on honing your Irish research skills. And in November, we usually try to do something related to military. So we have Jonathan Vance from the Department of History at UWO doing a presentation for us as well. And finally, in December, we have Carol Small from the Middlesex Centre Archives. She's going to be doing a presentation on what's new in Middlesex Centre Archives. I did just want to mention that as of right now, these presentations are booked to be live in person like we normally do them at the Riverside Church, the Family History Center. However, of course, with COVID-19, we're going to be playing it by ear, so these could very well end up being virtual presentations very similar to this. So we'll make sure that everybody is notified one way or the other and has access to being able to register for them. The final announcement I want to mention, just for anybody that is not yet a member of Ontario Ancestors, as of June 1st, Ontario Ancestors did put their membership on at half price for the remainder of the year. So it's actually only $37 to actually get the Ontario Ancestors membership. However, you want to make sure that when you are registering, if you're thinking about doing that, it's actually a fantastic price. If you're doing that, make sure that you do opt to join some of the SIGs or sponsorships, or some of the London branch. Our branch fee for the year is only $12, so it's a very reasonable cost to have access to some fantastic resources. So I'm going to pass it over to Sheila so that she can do a quick introduction of Joe O'Neill.
Great, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome everyone. We're very happy that you're here. I understand from Ben that we have over 100 people joining us, which is at least double what we usually have. So we'll be really interested when you get the survey, if you would take a few minutes to fill that out, because we're very interested in knowing whether this is your first time attending a meeting of our branch or the Historical Society, where you're coming from, because many of our members are not from the local area, and how you heard about the presentation. Of course, we're interested in your feedback on the presentation and perhaps some other speakers that you would like to see in the future. So when I asked Joe for a bio about who he is and what his interests are, he was very humble about it. So I been trying to get this presentation going last year for our normal Saturday morning presentation, and unfortunately that's a very busy day for Joe. So he actually recommended that we do this with a joint presentation with the Historical Society, and that's what we're doing tonight. So we're very pleased to welcome the Historical Society tonight. I know Cindy Hartman is on the call, and she is the president of the Historical Society. So in terms of his background, Joe is known to many Londoners, of course. He's a great historian and is often asked to be a source of information about the history of London and London's burial sites. He's the current managing director of O'Neill Funeral Home, which is located on William Street in London, which was founded in 1963, and this has remained a family-owned and operated business for over 50 years. In addition to his professional career, Joe's very engaged in London's history and heritage. He's a past chair of the London Advisory Committee on Heritage, the purpose of which is to advise the City of London's Municipal Council on the conservation of cultural heritage resources in the community and to guide London in the conservation of its cultural heritage through planning, education, and stewardship. Cultural heritage resource means a human work or a place that gives evidence of human activity or has spiritual or cultural meaning or value and which has been determined to have historical value. Additionally, Joe is the current treasurer of Eldon House, which is a well-known historical landmark with heritage designation in the City of London. He describes himself as an all-around rabble-rouser, descendant of Republican rebels, and a scallywag of the lowest common denominator. So his presentation entitled Undertaking, a Review of Death and Funeral Home Records, Past and Present, will be looking back at death and funeral home records and practices of the past and how they compare with current practices, which are undergoing rapid changes due to the impact from the current COVID-19 pandemic. And he'll give you a cautionary warning to future historians that they are going to have trouble searching for their ancestors by unusual means in the future, and because of these very recent changes. So we're very interested in hearing more about that. Sometimes over to you, Joe.
Okay, can you hear me? I assume you can hear me. If you can't hear me, let me know.
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, thanks. Just so you know, I'm also doing this on my own live streaming, and I'll be sticking it on my own YouTube channel. I'm going to give you a quick look here. I hope I don't do the Blair Witch Project. So there's my table, and there's my video camera. And I just want you to know that this being the internet, and it's full of internet trolls, I have come ready tonight for any of you who have questions that bother you. There's my War of 1812 flintlock. And the other thing you give when you give a good speech is, of course, you also my 1842 U.S. Naval Cutlass. So any of you get out of line, I know how to handle you. When I was preparing this a year ago, I thought I knew what I was talking about, and I've seen so many changes with the pandemic and COVID-19 that it's changed the nature of my talk. So I'll get into one example of that, but what I did is I wrote up 2 pages of gibberish, if you can read my handwriting. And what I'm going to do is these are different topics that all relate to tonight. So if any of you have a question on anything specific here, because I could probably talk for 6 hours on this stuff, just let me know. The first one, I'll start out something my mom said to me today, something for all of you to be aware of. My mom's been a genealogist for years. She says, every time history changes hands, it changes or it loses something. The exception to that would be oral history of the First Nations, and I can explain that later. Pioneer burials and First Nations burial grounds are often the very same thing in Ontario here. How to find graves. If you're looking for a graveyard on a piece of property, you don't know where to start, I can give you advice on that. What goes on in a graveyard? Burials, when I'm talking to the archaeologist, why do some graves point one way, why do some point the other? Some of the things they found in burials. For example, we sometimes find lime in burials, and that was evident of a pandemic or cholera breakout. But we found other things. We found that sometimes people are buried backwards on purpose. I have a story to talk about religious rezoning of cemeteries. And I've even was talked to once, archaeologist phoned and asked me and said, why is this person buried this way? And I said, well, that person was a witch. Whoever buried them thought that, they were going to come back and get them. All original pioneer cemeteries had some kind of marker, but the marker could be long gone by now. Lost cemeteries all over the city and recovered cemeteries. Something an archaeologist said to me once. One archaeologist quick off the cuff remark was 99% of all cemeteries that they've investigated in Ontario, whether they were abandoned or active, are both larger than they suspected and older than they suspected. And that's going by official records. For example, St. Peter's Cemetery here in London says they opened in 1861. I found records in the archives, first burials 1857, and I think they go back to 1826. Use of boots on the ground. If you want to learn about a cemetery, put boots on the ground. There's a lost cemetery, I'm pretty convinced, up on the old psychiatric grounds, and I could take you and show you the difference in the grass and the land, and you could see instantly. Lost records. We're going to have a big problem in the future with the way records are going. Newspapers are not printing anymore, or they're cutting back. There's now this organization called remembering.ca that handles newspaper notices across Canada for the Free Press and Chatham and other newspapers. What happens to remembering.ca website 20 or 50 years from now? Somebody going to microfilm a website and put it on some sort of archival medium that you'll be able to read 20 or 50 years from now. When we talk about old graves, why we can't find them, the grave robbers in the medical school. Why graves get left behind. Private burials on private land which take place aren't being recorded. It's a problem that is happening to this very day, believe it or not. If you bury somebody and after you bury them you go to register to death, the Registrar General in Ontario will not give you a burial permit and will not accept a death registration. So think about that. Somebody goes ahead, does a private burial, doesn't record it, doesn't tell anybody. What a mess you have. The importance of family records. And then I get into where I get some of my books. And if I get time, I'd love to tell the story of Daniel Sullivan and his lost burial. So I'm going to start. About a year or two ago, I was on the news a lot about the lost burials at the fairgrounds, Western Fairgrounds, and that's the old St. Paul's Anglican Cemetery. Now, according to a London Free Press notice, newspaper article, archaeologists said that they had uncovered records of 8,000 burials at St. Paul's Cemetery over the years, the 25, 30 years it was open. I apologize, I know stories, but sometimes I forget dates. So I talked to the people at Woodland Cemetery, and they told me that their records only show 3,500 burials. So 8,000, 3,500. Why is the difference? Like what's going on? What's happening here? So I came up with a few theories. One of them was that they just ran out of money to move the graves. They maybe left people behind because they weren't very good people according to the day. They were the alcoholics, or they had the wrong color skin, or who knows what. Or one of my working theories is that these were people who had died of cholera, typhus, or diphtheria, and the grave workers, the grave diggers, were terrified of digging up the graves. Now, the problem with that theory is that the whole purpose of digging up St. Paul's and moving it is back in 1850, a doctor in London, England, discovered that cholera, the disease, came from groundwater. He didn't understand why. It comes from basically mixing your sewage with your drinking water. He didn't know that, but he did prove that cholera came from polluted drinking water. So the science of the day said, well, we're burying bodies underground. These people have cholera. This must be where the disease is coming. And for 1850, that's actually really good science. It was they were wrong, but they actually made an effort to figure it out. So they said, here in London, pass the bylaw, dig all the bodies up and move them. So In 1850, all the bodies, supposedly, many were left behind, were dug up from around St. Peter's Basilica and St. Paul's Cathedral and moved to different cemeteries. And there were other pioneer cemeteries that were dug up in the core, and they missed them too. They missed burial grounds down near the forks of the Thames. They missed a burial pit for amputations at Victoria Park, and there was a cemetery on Hope Street they missed too. I left bits behind. So what happened is that when London East, that was part of a separate town that was east of Adelaide, was annexed in around 1870, 1875, St. Paul's Cemetery and the Methodist Cemetery, which was part of St. Paul's, it was all one chunk of land, but the Anglican Church gave the Methodist Church a chunk of land for their own cemetery. They all had to be dug up and moved. The Methodist Cemetery was moved to the new Mount Pleasant, and everything from St. Paul's was moved to Woodland. So they were supposed to dig up all the bodies that had the diseases and get them out of there. That was the whole point. That was the whole point. But I always thought they left them behind on purpose. With COVID-19, when I've been seeing, and this applies to all the cemeteries, I'm not talking about anyone, I'm not going to pick on anyone specific. When I've been looking at how cemetery workers are reacting today to COVID-19, I completely believe that the main reason the bodies are left behind is people fear disease. And I'll give you an example. One cemetery I go to right now, when I go out to the cemetery, we take what's called a casket spray or casket saddle. These are the flowers that sit on top of a casket. And they'll be here in the funeral home, and then we take them, we set them on top of the casket when the casket's sitting on the grave. Well, the people in the cemetery are so afraid, they won't even touch the casket spray. They won't even pick up the flowers and move them. They tell the family that if they want any flowers, they have to take them off the casket themselves, or they're just going to leave the casket on, the casket spray on the casket, and they're going to bury it. So today, in our day and age, when we're all wearing masks and gloves and whatnot, the cemetery workers are terrified to touch flowers on top of the casket. I've also seen after we've left that some cemeteries, they will actually spray down the casket with bleach and water and wipe it down before they pick it up and put it into a crypt or into a vault. So when you see things like that happening today, I can't prove it, but I'm absolutely convinced that a number of these graves would have been overlooked on purpose, and that's why they're left behind. Now, does that mean we've actually got 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 graves left behind at the fairgrounds? I have no idea. And I think the only way we'll find out is if they actually do an excavation or get some ground penetrating radar. But until then, who knows what's there? On a side note, one thing that's unique about London compared to other communities is we don't have a segregated black cemetery, which is very unique across Ontario. And I don't know if we ever did have one. That could be the way London is, or there could be one that was just never talked about. Or maybe the graves that were left behind that was the black section, along with the diseased section. You never know. Speaking of black cemeteries, Brian Prince and his wife, I forget his wife's name, Shannon. I didn't want her to get mad at me. If you go down to Buxton National Historic Site near Chatham, that's where many of the first refugee slaves escaping to Canada came up and settled. And it's, like I said, it's down south of Chatham. And the Buxton site is amazing if you ever get a chance to visit it. The church is there, the cemetery is there, the school is there, and then there's a museum and there's a bunch of other stuff. It's an amazing site to go to. Now, Brian Prince is a direct linear descendant of the first refugee slaves buried in the old cemetery. And what Brian did is he actually bought more land and he reactivated the old cemetery and added land to it. And so this old pioneer cemetery is now actually an active cemetery. I mean, you can go down and buy yourself a grave if you want and be buried there. Now, big problem. Over the years, long before Brian got a hold of it, the old pioneer cemetery fell into disrepair. The stones started toppling over, ground was an upheaval. And Brian said that many years ago, somebody from the county came along, they lifted all the gravestones, And then they just brought in heavy machinery equipment and just leveled everything. So there's probably stones buried underground that get run over and got cracked and busted or buried even deeper. So they just brought in earth grading equipment, flattened it all, and then they put all the stones back. And Brian said to me, he says, you know, I'm 99% certain that none of the stones were put in the right spot. So if you got a stone that's sitting right here that says, you know, Mrs. Smith, he doubts Mrs. Smith is there. So he says, how all the church records were lost too. He wasn't quite sure how the church records were lost. But the records of where the burials were, where the maps were all lost. So I'm going to go off on this. I'll come back to why they could have been lost in a minute. So what he has been doing for the past number of years is he made up his own map of the cemetery, and he has been painstakingly, piece by piece, bit by bit, going through every little bit of research that he can to find out where somebody is buried. For example, he will look up an old newspaper from 150 years ago, and there will be a mention in the obituary that Mrs. Smith was buried beside Mrs. Jones. And he goes, oh, okay. Now, the newspaper may not say she was buried on the left side or the right side, but there might be another little clue that's saying that the family of Mrs. Smith was standing at the grave, and their shadows late in the afternoon, you know, cast on Mrs. Jones' stone. So you know where the sun is, it's in the west. So that means if the family's standing and their shadow is casting on Mrs. Jones, that means they were to the west of Mrs. Jones' grave. So that's a little clue. Mrs. Smith is buried to the west of Mrs. Jones. He still doesn't know where Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Jones is, but he knows where those two are together and which side they're on. So if you can imagine, and he goes through everything. He asks people for, do you have diaries? You know, is there any mention of a diary, you know, of someone in the family who died or passed away? When, where, what did they die of? Sometimes when cholera or typhus went through, for example, when the cholera epidemic hit London here in 1832, 10% of the population died, and everybody would have been buried together at that time. So you go through little clues like this, and painstakingly taking clues from places that you would never think of. He's been slowly assembling a map. Now, he's got a long way to go, and he's put the word out that any of you have anything to do with Buxton, any information, he'd love to hear from you. No, but again, the silliest little bit of information, like standing and looking at the sun as it sets, the season, what a person died from, anything like that can really add up and provide little clues. Now, why does the cemetery get lost? Why do records get lost? I'm going to tell you a story, and this ties in with some of my Ojibwe heritage. I'm going to back up a bit. In First Nations, in the Ojibwe culture, the storytellers, the Mediwiwin, their oral history is very different from history as we know it in our culture. Their history has to be exact. For example, let's say their history is recording when crops are buried. If crops are planted, not buried, planted. Let's say crops are not planted at the right time and the frost kills it. There's no redo, there's no reset. You starve to death. A modern day equivalent of that would be an uncle of mine used to teach helicopter mechanics up in Canadore College up in North Bay. And I remember he told me when I was in bombing school in Toronto that they expected every one of their graduates to get 100%. He said, we might pass you if you get 99%, but we expect 100% on all tests and all exams. I said, that's terrible. I only need like 75 to pass my course. And he says, yes, but your clients are all dead. He says, imagine being up in the air 10,000 feet and finding out your mechanic only knew 90% of what he was doing. So it's mission critical. It has to be exact or people end up dead. For the First Nations, the first people who didn't have a social background, social assistance. I mean, look at the pandemic today. Look at the social assistance that's coming out, the emergency payments to businesses and people. No such thing 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So oral history had to be exact. It had to be perfect. And part of the way they did that is children were tested at a very young age. And whenever they found somebody who had what I would call a photographic memory, They might be high-functioning autistics, Asperger's syndrome, something like that, but somebody who had that perfect memory, those were some of the people that were chosen to preserve the oral history. Now, a little bit more back to modern times. When I was a funeral director, that meeting just hung up on me. Hold on. So we'll wait a minute. Yeah, we back? We good? Okay. So.
Yeah, I think so. We just have a little bit of bandwidth issue, I think, Joe. So.
That's okay.
It gets better for a while.
Well, whenever I say something wrong, CSIS or the RCMP jumps in and, taps the line and messes up everything. So, when I was a funeral director's apprentice in Ottawa in 81, 82, I learned a lot there. One of the most interesting things is we used to do a lot of burials in the Gatineaus up in Quebec. And one day when I was there, it was the first or second month I was there, all the guys are excited. Oh, wait till you see the cemetery, wait till you see the cemetery. And I was sort of freaked out because I'm going, these are guys that have been working for 20, 30 years and they're getting excited over a cemetery. It's like, really? Like, what's wrong with you guys? So they just all grinned. So we get to this tiny little country cemetery, beautiful hillside overlooking in the hills of Quebec. And the first thing I notice is the grass is perfect. For those of you in London, it looked better than the lawns of London Life. For those of you who don't live in London, it looked better than a putting green on a golf course. Not only that, all the stones were perfectly upright. The stones were all polished. No, this was in Quebec. The stones were all polished with turtle wax, I kid you not, and he painted in all the letters. And the old guy did it. He had about maybe 6 teeth left in his mouth. I think he maybe took a bath once a year. His French and English were equally broken, but he had one of those perfect photographic memories. And the other thing that impressed me is he hand dug all the graves, wouldn't use a machinery. And when you looked at the grave, I swear to God, it looked like somebody took a laser beam and cut the grave. It was absolutely incredible. I could not believe it. I'm just looking at this going, wow. So you put this all together, and then I got to talk to him after the burial, and he went along and told me everybody's life story. I mean, I could have spent a whole day. He knew he had memorized in his head perfectly exactly where every single grave was. He knew how big the grave was. He knew the distance. He said, oh yeah, that one's 6 inches apart and that one's 4 because it was snowing that day and I've read blah, blah. And he could tell you the life story of everybody that was buried there, when they were born, when they died, without looking at the stone. He could tell you everything. And I said, do you write this all down? And he says, oh no, can't read, can't write. And I said, well how do people going to know this other than you? He says, oh no, I don't tell anyone. He says, if I tell somebody, I lose my job. He says, the only way I keep my job is I'm the only one who knows. And that was job security for him. I don't know what happened to that cemetery. I don't know what happened to that man, but I imagine that when he died, all that information went away with him. So I'm thinking that he's not the only one who did that too. There were probably many people like him. So you see that connection. Now, the difference is in First Nations, they knew people would die and the information would be gone. So every generation, they brought in new young kids and, okay, you sit there and you learn from the elders. But we don't have that kind of tradition. We didn't have the information. We only have information that was written down. And then sometimes when it was written down, I'll give you a good example. There was a Scottish cemetery on the northeast corner of Adelaide and Oxford. There was a Scottish cemetery, Scottish Presbyterian. It was shut down, I think, 1955, about 100 years old. And the graves were all moved to Woodland Cemetery. The records for those burials were all destroyed in a church fire. And there was no backup records. Nobody had a hard drive and plugged in anything extra. And nobody made any photocopies. If there was, nobody knew about it. So what happened is that a couple of years ago, they knew that the stones were moved, but they didn't know how many stones were moved or where they were exactly. So over the past 5-6 years, Woodland Cemeteries had archaeologists out every summer exploring the grounds, cleaning up stones, learning stories. And they went to one section where they thought there might be a few stones, and I think they uncovered over 30 or 40 stones from that cemetery that were buried underground, laying down in Woodland Cemetery that nobody knew about. Now, Woodland was established 1875, not 1675 or 1275, but 1875, and there was no record of these stones. They were lost. So that might also explain why you have 8,000 burials at St. Paul's and only 3,500 recorded burials at Woodland. But everybody, including the cemetery staff and the people who ran Woodland, were absolutely flabbergasted at the number of stones. And they've all been set into nice limestone. And you can go out and see them today. They're at the back corner, at the back northeast corner. So there's a lot of history that's being recovered. So I'm not telling you much about how to find records, but these are the stories that you go around and you see London. Another thing I was doing, I was just out with what's called at the Nichols Pioneer Cemetery. When London annexed in 1997, took over about half of Westminster County, we also took over many lost pioneer cemeteries. There are many, many, many lost graveyards. Some have been excavated, some have been lost behind. Right downtown here, if you a 20-minute drive, I could probably, if I had the time, I could point out 20 or 25 of them to you, known, real, and suspected, or former. They're all over the place. My favorite one I like to talk about is, everybody talks about how the Grand Theatre is haunted downtown Richmond Street, and they say that's because of Ambrose Small. My theory is, and this is true, the first Catholic cemetery in the city of London was St. Lawrence's, and it was right where the Theatre of London is. So you remember the movie Poltergeist? They moved the stones, they didn't move the bodies. That's exactly what happened. And when they built the Grand Theatre around 1901, 1902, there was a newspaper article I found in the archives saying nobody knew where all these graves were. And I'm quite sure there might have been a few left, because a few years back now, they were working on Fullerton Street and they dug up the graves. So if the Grand Theatre is haunted, it's not because of Ambrose Small, it's all the forgotten Catholic pioneers who were, disturbed and maybe built on top of. Other things here, oral history. Oh, pioneer burials and First Nations burial grounds. I'm pretty convinced that, not all, but I'm pretty convinced that that some of the early burial grounds that we know as pioneer burial grounds were native burial grounds. And I'll give you one example. I'll finish this and I'll get to the questions. Long story short, the Nichols Cemetery is out, if you go up Westminster Road, no, not Westminster, Dingman Drive. If you go up Wellington Road South, where Dingman Drive is. Now, this is something I'll go on the side. I used to say, do you know where the old ice house is? The old London Gardens. People go, yeah, people don't know that now. So I say, do you know where Costco is out Wellington Road South? Everybody knows it instantly. If you go out where the driving range is, south of Costco, Nichols Cemetery is about half a mile off the road there, and it's right on the edge of Dingman Creek. Now, very, very common to see burial grounds on the edge of a creek, the old early ones. But Nichols Cemetery always struck me as weird, because usually they're also close to a road or a path or something, and this is way set in the middle of the farm. So even back in the day, the original land grants, if you're going way back to the War of 1812, this thing's really set in. It's not near a trail or anything. Now, the reason I think it might be an old Aboriginal burial ground originally that was used by the pioneers is, and this is in my own ancestry, one of the ways that they moved bodies back in the day is they would use a canoe. So you would take somebody from the village or the house, put the body in the canoe, and you would take the canoe down or upstream. You might, if it's something like Dingman Creek, if it's not springtime where it's flooding and rushing, like even right now this time of year, it's shallow enough you can walk in Dingman Creek and just drag the canoe along. And then what you would do is you'd have the burial ground just up above the, you'd have it up just above the flood line. And that was very common. So the other thing too is, especially with Dingman Creek and some of these other pioneer burial sites, there's lots of really interesting archaeological sites along Dingman Creek. And when you see a preponderance of archaeological sites that belong to First Nations, and then you see the settlement of some of the early settlers, and then a lot of the early settlers too, like my family, had mixed blood going way back, because there's not that many people around, and sometimes if you didn't want to marry your first cousin, there wasn't much choice. So there's a lot of mixed blood, especially in Westminster Township, and that's, I think, is what's going on there. Now, I'm just looking here. Let's see. Was there an established protocol for recording mass burials circa 1846? No, there wasn't. In fact, that's a big problem. There was some old funeral directors I was talking to who had ancestors who were in the business back at the time of, Spanish flu pandemic. So just at the end of First World War. And what had happened is he said that they didn't even know where their own grandmother was buried because it was so busy and so insane and so crazy that they lost track of where their own family members were buried. So the other thing too, back in 1846, I doubt there would be anything in paper there, and I'll tell you why. There's a big problem. There's a famous story that relates to Lucan, Ontario, you know, where the Black Donnellys are and all that stuff. And one of the historians told me up there, before the railroad came through southwestern Ontario, came through London in 1854, 1855. Hold on, I'm going to turn this off. Air conditioning. Otherwise, noise is too loud. So what happened is, before the railroad come through, everything was horribly expensive. So there's a famous story of a town or county clerk up in Biddulph Township, or Lucan, Ontario, who, instead of using paper money, uses actual silver to buy a book to record minutes and meetings. And he got trouble for that because back then, paper money was not worth a pound note was not worth a pound sterling. Even by British standards, I was looking at a British contract for bringing up supplies from Port Stanley to London, and if they would pay you 80% less in real silver than they would in paper. And I imagine the farther you moved away from civilization, the worse that got. So they were really mad at him for buying this book and using real silver instead of paper. So there was a shortage of things like paper and ink and everything else. And the records that were made before the railroad came through and the price of paper and ink and everything dropped were minimal at best, and only the absolute things to be recorded and be necessary. So that's why there's so much stuff lost. The other thing that you're going to run into, if you're researching records, especially in the London area, even southwestern Ontario, there are several what I would call memory holes. And this is going to affect, this is why you're going to have real trouble looking up certain records. So, first of all, War of 1812 comes along, specifically MacArthur's raid November of 1814. If you've ever read about the American Civil War and Sherman's March to the Sea, MacArthur's 1,000-man raid, and it was almost 1,000 men. I figured out 975, so that's pretty close. He crosses at where Wallaceburg is. He comes down Longwoods Road. He comes through the London area, Commissioners Road, goes through Ingersoll. Ingersoll then was called Oxford. He completely flattens it to the ground. He gets to the Grand River. There's a British company, the 103rd Regiment of Foot, that is apparently threatening him, and so he gets tired and turned around. And both the British and the Americans neglect to mention. Oh, hold on. For those of you on Twitch, the thing went crazy again. And we're back. Okay, so what's happening? General MacArthur is marching down. He runs into a bunch of well-entrenched Mohawk First Six Nations warriors. He gets scared. He leaves the Grand River, and he comes back along what is now Highway 3. And along the way, everything is destroyed, flattened, and wiped out. Every book, every piece of paper, everything is gone. So all the records that exist, unless somebody hid them, we're really lucky. Basically, records are destroyed. So anything pre-1814, gone. Next problem that comes along. The courthouse in Victoria down near Long Point, burns down 1826. That's why London where it is. Well, all those records go bye-bye. The big London fire of 1846 here in London, then called Canada West, now London, Ontario. Dan Brock told me a building called the Hall of Records. So 1846, big fire, huge parts of London destroyed, all those records go kaput. 1857 was a year actually that would have been worse than 2020 is for us. Many things went wrong. A huge economic depression worldwide, end of the Crimean War. But what happened in London was there was a thing called the Black Frost that hit it was actually right about this time of year, middle to late June, and it destroyed anywhere from 60 to 80% of all crops in the area. It's hard to get accurate figures because I go and I read Old London Free Press and Old London Advertiser, and they're all full of happy news. You know, we found another field of crops. Things aren't that bad, folks. Look on up. However, what happens over the next 5 years is records are gone. From 1858 to about 1861, there's not even any city directories made. It's estimated up to 75% of all businesses in London go bankrupt, and the population of London decreases by 1/3 from about 15,000 to 10,000. Some people do starve to death. There is some disease, but most of it is people getting the heck out of Dodge. Go west, young man, greener pastures. So there's a huge memory hole. The American Civil War and our connection to the American Civil War, another huge memory hole because we sold war supplies to both the Union and the Confederacy, and that's another whole talk for another whole. So all those records go bye-bye too. So basically, decent records don't really start until about 1870, 1871, and a lot of them are messed up. Like if you go today, you go to MPAC and you say, oh, I'm doing some work on property taxes. How old is my house? Well, according to the Land Registry Office, everything in London was built around 1870, 1871. My house next door is listed as 1871. And then Hillary Neary, God bless her, did some search and found out that looks like it was actually built 1855. And by the way, and another story for another whole day, the lost Confederate gold is actually buried in the basement of my house. And before you laugh too hard at that, any of you have watched History Channel, you know, the lost Confederate gold, that TV show? We had one of the producers up here, we have him in Woodland Cemetery, and we did have him looking in the basement of my house, I kid you not. But that's another talk for next year, why the lost Confederate gold's in the basement of my house. So there's a lot of cool stories like that get lost, and a lot of stories that get really lost. And then the other reason records get lost and burials is, now, one of the very best books, well, you can't read the binding on this, so I apologize. I gotta show this to you. It's autographed. And this book is The March of Medicine in Western Ontario by Dr. Seaborn. Fantastic book. There's one, it's autographed there too. There's a copy up in the archives at Western. There's a copy in the London room. If you wish to borrow it, you'll have to take out a second or third mortgage, and you'll have to get in your hands and knees and Big Arthur to take a look at it. And here I am with my copy, and as you can see, it's a lot read. Dr. Seaborn talks about a lot of the lost burials in London. So he starts out, this is a great place for somebody looking for lost burials. But he specifically mentions that city fathers, and it would have been city fathers, there wasn't any women on city council in 1870 or 1890 that I know of. He talks about how there would be an outbreak of, let's say, cholera or typhus or anything, and how city fathers would downplay it and pretend it didn't happen, pretend it didn't exist, try and suppress the information because they didn't want to scare away new people coming to the city. So that was something that that's why you leave. That's why there's so many missing stories, so many missing things, because people didn't want to do. They just didn't want to scare away new immigrants. So, but why do records get lost? Then we get to the story. This is a weird story. And a really tragic one. So, this is a story of Daniel Sullivan. Now, how I got onto this story is they put up a fireman's monument to everybody who was killed in action or died as a result of disease for firemen. And it's down on Horton Street at Colburn in front of the main fire station. And there were two problems. Number one, everybody, including the Free Press and CTV News, said, first fireman's monument ever in London, which is not true. The first fireman's monument in London was put in the Methodist Cemetery where St. Paul's is. In fact, if you know where the Mission Store is, you know where the Tim Hortons is, right there at the fairgrounds? If you go right across the street, that's where the monument was. And that monument still exists. It was moved to Mount Pleasant Cemetery, and if you go to the crematory in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, you can still see it there, and it has the firefighter stuff all over it. Now, all the names that were put on the stone downtown, actually I was chair of Latch, and I had this moved. My mom helped do a lot of research. Daniel Sullivan, and I believe Daniel Sullivan was mulatto, mixed race, because he lived in what was called the Hollow. And the only other Daniel Sullivans I could find were actually refugee slaves. So, Hyman's factory, tannery I should say, blows up. And forgive me, I forget it was the 1780s or 1880s. No, 1870, 1880s. I should have brought Dan Brock's book down here and looked up the date. But it's a very tragic story. How many of you have seen those heritage moments that used to run on TV all the time? There's a very famous one about the Halifax explosion, and there's the telegraph guy who's, typing saying, please stop the train, please stop the train. And because he stayed and got the message through, the train was saved, but then he was killed in the explosion. Well, at Hyman's tannery, the boiler went bad. There was a problem with the boiler. So what happened is Daniel Sullivan stayed behind and it said, look, everybody get out, get out, get out. I'll try and hold it. I'll give you time. So because Daniel Sullivan stayed and tried to contain the boiler from going, even though he knew it was a losing battle, a lot of people were able to escape and save their lives. Now, the other thing you need to know about Daniel Sullivan is he was a volunteer fireman, and when his death occurred, when the boiler blew up, it was exactly at the point that London was going from a volunteer fire department to a full-time paid fire department. And he was actually going to be hired as a full-time fireman, according to the fire chief at the time. So, the story of Daniel Sullivan comes out. The boiler blows up. Boom. The story of what he did comes out. And then reading, it was for 3 days, his story is covered in both the London Free Press and the London Advertiser in great, great detail. So, what happens is, now reading the story of the first day of the explosion is very graphic. It's like Stephen King novel, seriously, because they find his body parts all over the place, like over a block. They identify him by his clothing. And so they take his different body parts and they sort of put them in order in this open coffin, and then they take the open coffin and they take it to his grieving mother and his widow and the child, and they put it in the house. And the newspapers go into really graphic detail, like describing the condition of his body and describing how his poor mother keeps fainting, and every time she wakes up and looks in the coffin, she faints again. And it's like, oh yeah, no kidding. So you're reading this and you don't know whether to laugh or cry. But because he sacrificed his life, the chief of the fire department says, I hereby declare him to be a member of my department, and he shall be buried with full honors. And he is. He's buried on a Sunday afternoon from St. Peter's Basilica. And what happens is both newspapers say in explicit detail that it was the biggest funeral that London had ever seen up to that point. They used one of the fire engines as a hearse. The military band from the local militia from Wolseley Barracks came out. They played the dirge. And both newspapers really cover his funeral in depth. They really, now, one of them will talk about all the hymns they sung, and another one will talk about who all the pallbearers were. They cover it like that. And they all agree that he was buried at St. Peter's Cemetery here in London. So, I wanted to find out where his grave was. And so, Deb Major up at the archives, up at the Diocese of London, great help to me. She went to bat, and she just ran herself into a brick wall. She said there was 2 records of burials. There's one for St. Peter's Cemetery, and then there was a separate record of burial that was held for about 20 or 25 years that the cathedral did, the basilica did. It was been the cathedral back then and it became basilica later. So she said, you know, Joe, she says, this is something that was done on purpose. For some reason, somebody didn't record his burial. And I had sent her copies of both the London Free Press and the London Advertiser. I said, look, you know, like, they don't describe where he's buried, but they, you know, everything is there. And she said they left him off the burial for sure. She said this was done on purpose. And so I started to wonder. I looked at where he lived. I looked up and I found out that there was, I also found out through our research at Western, London had a big mulatto, you know, mixed race group of people living here. And then something else struck me, and this is where I'm going to get into the religious rezoning thing. Something that my mom and dad pointed out to me. I've been going out in funerals since I was 12 years old, but I didn't notice this right away. It used to be when you had a Catholic burial, or you had other burials, one of the things that the priest would do at the burial at St. Peter's Cemetery is he would consecrate the grave, bless the ground. And as a kid, I always thought that was strange because I used to say, how come they're blessing the ground? It's an empty hole. The ground's in a, you know, big pile of dirt on the side. Shouldn't he be blessing the pile of dirt? And I always get in trouble asking stupid questions like that. So, but what they would do is they would bless the grave, and then he would finish the prayers and the burial would take place. Now, if you were an alcoholic, or, you know, maybe the priest didn't like you, I don't know, maybe you didn't put enough money in the collection plate, or whatever it was you did to get the priest angry at you, the priest would just skip the blessing part of the grave. So you would be buried in unconsecrated ground. Oh my God, right? And that went on for a long time. So, I was talking to Bishop Sherlock many years ago, long before he died, and I'd asked him about this because I said, I heard a story that you changed that. And he said, yes. He said, no. He says, I can't remember exactly when it happened. He became bishop in 1978, but he said, I had so many fires to put out, you wouldn't believe it. But he said, I heard about what was going on and I was appalled. So what he did is he had priests go out and stand at the front gate of every single cemetery in the Diocese of London, not just London, but the diocese, every known cemetery, every major cemetery. So here in London, it would have been Forest Lawn, Mount Pleasant, Woodland, St. Peter's, Pond Mills, all of them. And he had the priest consecrate the whole cemetery, one fell swoop. I hereby consecrate the whole ground and everything in it. So you didn't have little pockets of consecrated and unconsecrated ground. The whole thing was done. So I said to him, I said, basically what you did was religious rezoning. And he laughed at that. But that's basically what happened. And that happened in the whole Diocese of London. I can't speak for other dioceses, but that's what happened. So everything was consecrated. But I got thinking to myself later, you know, if right up until 1978, you would have some of the old priests who would refuse to consecrate the ground because they didn't like the person they were burying, then back 100 years earlier, you know, would something like that happen back then too? You know, it was interesting. So that's anyhow. Are there any questions before I go talking on? I don't know if anybody's got any questions or anything.
Yeah, there's a few of them here. There was a question about did Orlo Miller do any research or writing about cemeteries in London?
Yes, he did. Now, before I quote Orlo Miller, although I think he was right, I got a good thing and a not so good thing to say about it. So, I asked Dan Brock once about Orlo Miller. If you've ever listened to Dan Brock, Dan is everything's. I love Dan's research because he won't publish anything unless he's got about 50 sources to prove it. So Dan's comment on Orlo Miller is Orlo never turned down a story he didn't like. Orlo was more of a storyteller than a researcher. Now, the flip side of that is Orlo Miller was the one who said that there were burials behind the courthouse, that the men who were hung there were buried behind the courthouse, and nobody believed him. And when they dug up the graves, Orlo Miller was quoted in the Free Press as being steaming mad. Now, the reason I love telling that story is one of my staff members here at the funeral home, John Oliveira, was a heavy equipment operator, And he was personally the man who dug up Peg Leg Brown. He was the man who dug up those graves. So even to this day, some people say, gee, do those graves still exist? I say, well, I can introduce you to the guy who dug them up. So we often joke about that he had no idea that after he retired as a heavy equipment operator, he'd be working in a funeral home. I said, well, probably years of digging sewers around London and digging up the old pioneer graves. So he did, he got it right, but be cautious. I like reading his stuff, but he wasn't after references, he was more getting word and story out. So take that into account. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's a question about are funeral home records readily available, or does it differ from from one funeral home to the next? And is there a time restriction, like current Ontario deaths, for example?
Yeah, 75 years, 100 years if it's under the Mental Health Act. I'll talk about that one in a minute. But yeah, funeral home records, unfortunately, are a mess. There's no, for example, the first Catholic funeral home in the City of London, it was Killingsworth, and it closed down 63 or 65, I can't remember, I think 65, and the man took all the records with him and they disappeared. Other examples, probably the oldest continuing operating funeral home in the City of London is Logan's. It's gone through a number of hands, but it's still the same business. However, they did at one time have records going back to the 1870s, but they had a flood back in the 1830s during the Depression era. So anything before 35 or 36 was destroyed in the flood. So there's no, funeral home records are really poor. There are some fine examples, exceptions. When I was a student in Toronto, one of the oldest funeral homes in Toronto I worked at as a student was Rose R. Morrison. They had been open since 1860. And when John Morrison, who I worked for, sold out to the corporations back in 1980, 1990, what he did is he took all the old records and he donated them. And I believe the Ontario Genealogical Society has copied them. And that's fantastic, that's great. But the reality is cemetery records and funeral home records, I wish they were better, because there's an old Irish cemetery that's buried under St. Michael's in Corktown, and I'm going back to the 1820s, 1830s, and I'm pretty certain that I have relatives buried under there myself, but who are they, where are they? So, that's on the O'Neill side. On my mom's side, I had 4 ancestors who fought at the siege of Fort Erie in 1814, and the one pioneer ancestor, one of them who stayed behind, my mom would tell me a story about how they tried to find his grave, and locals in the area said, yeah, it was on that farm in that corner, that crossroads, but the farmer wanted extra room to plant crops, so he just plowed over the stones, and nobody knows what happens to the stones. So most of the old, the one other one that is donated is, and I forget their name at the minute. There used to be 2 funeral homes in Lucan. The funeral home that buried the Donnelly family, all of their records have been donated, and they're at the London Room. But with exceptions like them and others, going after funeral home records, it's pretty bad anymore. Next question.
I think that's all the other questions. I've got one more here. Question is, are there any burials at the old asylum property on Highbury and Dundas?
I actually am convinced there are. Now, that's a fascinating story, and the reason that's of personal interest is my grandmother was buried there. So, for those of you who think I'm crazy, I have the paperwork to prove it. Quite seriously, most people didn't know that children were buried there. So, probably my great-grandmother lost 2 children, and they're buried on the grounds there somewhere. Now, in the early days, there was a contract signed by the London Insane Asylum. It was with Logan Funeral Home and Woodland Cemetery that the burials would take place out there. But this is before motorized cars. And the other thing is that this would be for people maybe had some means and some money. Now, I'm just going to try and think of Dundas Street here, and then the circular drive, and the asylum was there, and the medical thing here. Way up in the corner up in here, for a number of years was what's called the incurables. It was actually called the Idiot Asylum. Now, I had run across a gentleman, and he died many years ago, but he had told me, if you go up that street from Dundas Street, now it's blocked now, where the train tracks are, you can't drive it, but at one time you could drive the street straight, you would go circular around the hospital, and you would go up to where the soccer fields are, and then it would end in the T intersection. Now, I told the story that I heard that the reason they never continued the road through to Oxford Street is there was a cemetery there, and they wouldn't put a road through the cemetery. So I had talked to the City of London, and you know, I think it was about 10 years ago now, we actually walked the grounds. It was about this time of year, and where the soccer fields are, if you go up there, you'll notice that the grass is different. The ground is different, and the grass is different than the rest of the other grass in the area. And there's a big rectangular patch. You might be able to see it from aerial maps, but sometimes you got to get feet on the ground. And that's where I think the Lost Cemetery is up there. I'm pretty much convinced too that I would say that any asylum, any orphanage, any home for the aged, the home for the incurables, idiot asylums, residential schools, any of them pre-World War I absolutely would have a lost burial ground. I would almost bet money on that. And likely anything pre-World War II. But definitely anything pre-World War I, because there was just no money, and they would have just went out and buried them. And I doubt records like that even exist. Now, here's the other big problem. We never knew my grandmother was there because it was a thing of shame. I had a great aunt who just died in Michigan at the age of 104, 105, maybe 5 years ago now. And she wanted to join the monastery, and she couldn't join any monastery in Canada because she was born in an insane asylum, and the people assumed that because of that she wasn't acceptable. So she had to go to Michigan, where nobody knew where she was, and join the monastery there. So people would lie about this too. And finally, it wasn't until 100 years after my grandmother's birth that we were allowed legally, without going through Freedom of Information request, to get any information on her, because the Mental Health Act seals up records for 100 years. So that's sort of a crime in a way too. So there you go.
Angela's just asking, where would
they cut out?
Digitized or searchable? Or?
I beg your pardon?
Oh, the asylum records, I'm assuming.
I don't know where those are. I'm hoping somebody could tell me. Let me know. Yeah, I would love to lay my hands on them, because, you know, when we had a death up there, it was really weird. Everything was so private, everything was so closed. Dealing with the asylums was just terrible. I hated going up there, not because of the people, but because of the staff and the way they treated you. It was just a terrible place to go whenever we had a death up there. And then nobody ever talked about it too. And the only way you would know is to read the medical certificate of death, which is a private document sealed up for 75 years normally, 100 years of Mental Health Act.
Excellent. I don't see any other new questions coming in. It's interesting you talked about all the records. I don't know if you had more. George.
I've got more. Now, here's another thing I can throw at you. I got lots of stuff I can throw at. Right now, there's a lot of controversy going on about development of Meadow Lily Woods. Meadow Lily is one of the most fascinating sites in all London. Meadow Lily is likely, there's an old story that has hung around, and it's come down through both pioneers and First Nations, so I put credence to it. The story goes that during Pontiac's rebellion back in the 1760s, there was a group of British soldiers either going to the rebellion or coming back, and they got caught by snow. So they built a blockhouse out in the Meadow Lily area. I think we know where it is roughly, but we're not sure. And they were starving, so they discovered some seed corn in some of the First Nations. The First Nations, fearing hunger, attacked and wiped them out, killed them all. So there could be a lost burial ground of British soldiers out there. There's at least one pioneer burial ground that's lost that we know is out there. There's a pet cemetery out there we know that's out there. There is likely at least, okay, this is the strange part. There's a burial mound, I'm pretty certain, out there. So there's probably 2 lost First Nations burial grounds of varying ages. And what is really unique about Middle Lily is there's a reburial ground. It's the only one I know of in London for First Nations. So here's the story. If you go up Richmond Street North at Windermere, hang right, so you're going east, that subdivision to the north, when that was built, this is back in the 1980s now or something. Anyhow, they discovered a First Nations ossuary, a burial ground. So they dug it all up. And what happened is the bones were all taken to Ron Medill, who was a classmate of my dad's, and he ran Medill Funeral Home. It's now Elliott Medill, out in Mount Bridges. And for 5 years, 6 years, Ron stored the bones in a casket. And over that 5 or 6 years, they brought him more bones. Ron was never told where they came from. I found out through other sources where they came from, or some of them came from. And he said his dog would always sit at attention beside the casket when he wasn't watching. He would always just sit there, you know, very respectfully, just kind of at attention. He said it always kind of not quite freaked him out, but it always made him wonder. So after 6 years, and there was some politics to be involved. It was through Oneida Nation, I believe, the Six Nations. There was a ceremonial reburial in Middle Lily Woods, and it's there's a tree out there. There's a few out there. There's one tree. I've walked on the place, and Gary Smith could take and show me where it is. So they reburied the bones with full ceremony, and it's near one of the 300-year-old trees, one of the biggest trees. Not quite under it. Be careful when they say bury under a tree, because when you bury under a tree, there's like thousands of roots, pretty big things, and it might take you half an hour, 45 minutes to cut through by hand a root this big, and then you hurt and kill the tree. So under the big tree is usually near the big tree, not right under. And I remember talking to somebody about the city from that. There was no record of this kept, believe it or not. And people at City Hall had heard about this story and thought it was just a made-up story or anecdotal or something. And I said, no, that the guy did. It's still alive. Ron Medill's still very much alive. And I remember Ron telling me the story, and he can't remember exactly where it is. So there is an interesting, really interesting story. So Middle Lily is full of really cool stuff. And then River Bend is another place. Oh, and here's one. I invited some of my friends from the City of London to watch tonight. So here's a story I love to tell, because this will get them all upset. And this is for true. Mr. Dearness, John Dearness, the man we named Dearness home after, was involved in the Ontario Historical Society, and he got together with the nephew of Chief Tecumseh, the Chief Tecumseh, who was killed at the Battle of the Thames in the War of 1812. So we're going way, way back in time. They got together when the nephew of Chief Tecumseh was very old, and they looked for his grave, because one of the possible burial sites of Chief Tecumseh was here, right in the middle of London. And so I went old maps and I overlaid, and where it is it would be where Lauren Ave School is, where the park they're going to put in. That was one of the burial sites, possible burial sites of Chief Tecumseh. There was one other burial site of Chief Tecumseh in London, and it's out at River Bend. And the interesting thing is that burial site, there is a known native burial ground out there. So, and there is some cool stuff along Little Creek there too. I'm just trying to think. There, I was reading years ago, I was up in the archives up at Western, where the Bishop's Palace is. It's no longer the Bishop's Palace, but it's the house that overlooks Blackfriars Bridge. It's just north of the bridge. If you look way up, you can't see it because it's all surrounded by trees. There was a native burial ground up there. And I also had heard that where the football field is for Central High School, that's not too far away from the Hope Street Pioneer Burial Ground. So there were stories that there were squatters there and early settlers there, and that might have been an early native cornfield that was cleared, and that's why the squatters moved in. So these two sites inside London that were Chief Tecumseh were supposed to be buried were also known sites of archaeological interest. And I thought that was an interesting coincidence. But I always thought that we should put a statue up to Chief Tecumseh at at Lornav School, just in case he is buried there. We might cover ourselves. What else do I have here? Oral history. How to find, okay, how do you find a cemetery on a piece of land where you don't know where it is? If you had, okay, let's say you have information that on this big farm or on this big, grounds of a hospital, that there was a burial ground, but you have absolutely no clues, no written record, no maps, no nothing. How do you search? Well, first thing you do, if possible, is pull up some old aerial maps. Pull up as many maps as possible that you can. Old aerial maps, anything. Maps hand-drawn, and look for irregularities. For example, if there was a lot of building or farms in the area, and there's an area where there was never any horses or any farms put or any buildings put, think about that. Number two, boots on the ground. Like I said, when you go up to where the old psych hospital was and you walk around and you see the difference in the grass, that sets you off. Number three, if you're completely lost, most lots in Ontario are roughly long rectangular north-south, because this way everybody has a little bit of sunlight. Farms aren't wide this way because then the neighbor behind you might not have. So usually they're this way. Most burials are usually on the east side of the property for a couple of reasons. Religious reasons. In different churches, for example, we bury facing the east because in the Bible it says when Jesus rises on the last day, we will be facing the east and rise with him. So you'll have burials on the east. The other thing too is, let's say you have a house and you go to, a lot of people die through the middle of the night, so you would bury first thing in the morning. Well, you'd bury again on the east side because you've had more light than on the west side. Another issue is look at London here. All of our industries on the east because prevailing winds are from the west. And so if you have any bad odors or smoke or anything, it carries on out into the country. The exception, of course, is Woodland and Mount Pleasant cemeteries are in the West End, but if you read how they built out there, the reason Woodland was put out there is they said it was so far out that they thought the city would never ever grow out that far. They couldn't believe that the city would ever get as far as where Woodland is. And also, people were used to going out by steamboat to Victoria Park, not Victoria Park, Springbank Park. And Woodland had its own steamboat stop. Part of it is still there, and that's part of the Victoria boat disaster history, because you can actually, the very last stop that people got on or got off before the Victoria tipped over and killed everybody is Woodland Cemetery. So there are exceptions like that. So you look on the east side, you look at places where nothing was ever disturbed or ever built. You look for maybe places that weren't farmed. And the other things you can do too, if you're really stuck, if you're looking for burials or just information on burials, here's this one I want to show you. This is the part that bothers me about paywalls and everything being hidden behind the internet. God bless everything being digitized, but what happens if in 5 or 10 years from now, governments say, okay, we've blown so much money on COVID-19, we're bankrupt, so, something, you want those library records, you only have to pay $5 a year, and then next year's $10 a year. Anything is digitized, anything that you can't lay your hands on in a book can be hidden behind a paywall. The other problem is, as you digitize text, you can make great mistakes, great errors. My original pioneer ancestors, the O'Neills, John O'Neill and Margaret O'Sullivan, their marriage record in 1834 in Toronto, the O'Neill looks like an E on the end, and it's just the way that the guy hand wrote the script, but the optical character recognition put O'Neill with an E. So when you do search through Ancestry.com, you don't come up with O'Neill, you come up with O'Neill with an E, even though it's wrong. And if you look at the original microfiche, but where I really found a lot of information, here's something I want to show you. I don't know if I can show you. There you go. The Michigan Pioneer collections. And it was a series of books. I bought this from the St. Thomas Library years ago when they started cleaning out a bunch of stuff. I'm both very happy they sold it to me and very angry that they sold it to me, so I'll stick with the happy part. So there's about 20 or 30 of these. You can get some of them online. So Pioneer and Historical Society, the state of Michigan. And you're probably saying, okay, Joe, why are you reading Michigan history to look for grave sites in London? Well, tons and tons and tons of pioneer recollections. And like I said, this is volume 12. I think there's 26 or 28 volumes, and I have them all. I believe I have them all. What happened is that the early pioneers, when the Erie Canal opened in 1826, the price of coming into the Great Lakes dropped by 90%. And that's why you see a lot of flooding of people in this area. However, think about the Great Lakes. Going down under Lake Erie and then back up to Detroit was twice as long as just crossing the border at Fort Erie, coming through the trails, and then crossing again to either Wallaceburg or Windsor. So many, many, many of the pioneers who came and settled in Michigan came through what is now present-day southwestern Ontario. So if you are looking up digitized versions of this online, and let's say it's a PDF or whatever it is, you do Control F or Command F if you're on a Mac for search, and you type in Upper Canada or Canada West. Upper Canada became Canada West around 1840. And if you do that, then all of a sudden you'll see these mentions that there were 6 of us coming through, and the little baby picked up the cholera, and we were near a town called St. Thomas, and we had to stop at the crossroad and bury her. So you get these little, remember the story I told you about Brian Prince looking for little snippets of information and putting together his map? You can do the same thing with books like this. And if you're looking at them online, then you look for tiny little snippets of things, and then you start looking for other things. Here's David D. Plain, First Nations history. Plains of, please don't, although I'm taking a Ojibwe license, please don't ask me to pronounce this. Fascinating history of the early battles between the Six Nations and the Three Fire Confederacy. There was a huge battle around the year 1700 down near Lake St. Clair where the Thames River empties, and even according to pioneer accounts, for European accounts, anywhere from 3,000 to 3,400 First Nation warriors attacked the Seneca village and wiped it out, and the bones laid above ground until the 1850s, believe it or not. So you can look little bits of history like that, and then you can look at modern day maps and try and imagine where the Seneca village was. Dr. Seaborn's book. Other things, I just grabbed a bunch of books at random off my bookshelf. Thames River Watershed. You start reading things like this. When the first settlers came and settled, you have to think that some of them died, obviously. They didn't live for 200 years or 300, unless there's a couple of you listening to me right now. So even though they may not say explicitly what a cemetery is, you have to think, okay, where is the cemetery? Where did they bury them? I mean, what did they do with the people? And one of the things that bothers me, when I read historical records, when I read books about where somebody famous was buried, looking for graves, or when I read, it could be anything. It could even be books about Egyptian archaeology, how they handled the bodies of the dead, how they embalmed them, how they transported them, how they did things. My one overall criticism of all the archaeologists and all the historians who write these books is 99% of the time I'm reading these works from different sources around the world, and I think to myself, you know, you can sure tell that none of these guys have ever actually embalmed a body or had to transport a body in person. They don't know what it's like. Because the thought that keeps popping into my head is I'll read an explanation in an archaeological article or a historical book of how they moved the body, and I'm going, you wouldn't do that in a million years. I mean, you'd have to be as strong as Arnold Schwarzenegger, or there's a simpler way to do that. So that's perhaps a little bit of insight I got, is I start thinking to myself, you wouldn't do that. You got to be nuts. And because as much as things change, they also stay the same. So thinking of that, so think to yourself, you know, if you have a death in the middle of wintertime and it's before cars exist, or let's say even in the middle of summer, there's no cars, you're not near a stream, so you can't put the body on a canoe. How far are you going to move that body before you dig a grave and bury it? So when they say, grandma died and she was transported to the so-and-so cemetery, and you look up a modern day map and the so-and-so cemetery is 10 miles away, stop and remember, when you're walking today, if you're walking at a fast pace, you're walking at 3 miles an hour, 5 kilometers an hour. And that's like walking real good, real fast, doing the Nordic walking with the walking sticks. If you're walking leisurely or carrying a load, you're walking 2 miles an hour. And to give you an example, before the railroad went in between Port Stanley and London, a military contract that a loaded wagon had to be moved from Port Stanley to London in 1.5 days, and an empty wagon had 1 day to move, like one direction, from one way to the other. So stop and think about that. So if you've got a burial and you've got a body to move, how are you going to do it? Who's going to help you? And then after that long walk, who's going to dig the grave? So stop and think from practical considerations, practical points of view. Other things you do is, for example, I look up I like Jenny Granger's book, Vanished Villages of Elgin. All of these old sites would have had a cemetery somewhere. Stop and think, where would have it been? Every old cemetery that existed at one time would have had some kind of marker. Now that marker could be long gone. It might have been an old tree, 300 or 400-year-old tree, and now the tree's long gone, fallen down. Or maybe earthworks or land harm. There was a story I was reading in the St. Thomas Historical Society, how one pioneer cemetery got established as 2 or 3 men were traveling. It might have been the Michigan Pioneer stuff. Anyhow, they're traveling, and one of the men takes sick and falls and drops dead. So they go to the local farmer and said, look, our buddy here dropped dead. And the farmer said, well, we don't have a cemetery here. He said, why don't we? He said, this very corner of land right at the crossroads, he says, how about we make a cemetery there, and then we'll probably use it for our own. And that's how that cemetery got established. I forget the name of it. So the marker was the crossroads. A lot of churches, old churches, would have had cemeteries. But got to be careful. The cemeteries are not always behind the church. There's if you go out of Stratford on Highway 7 towards Shakespeare, now I forget if it's before you hit Fryfogle Inn or past it, there's a Pioneer Cemetery that's on the south side of the street, but the church is kitty corner on the north side of the street, the very opposite corner. So sometimes you see things like that. And Fryfogle Inn is a good example. It's an old Pioneer Inn that was on a travel route. And there's a Pioneer Cemetery on it, but it's right beside the inn almost. So you look up these old stories, you look up the stories of travel, you look up these places, and you start putting little things together. It's what you do is you take little bits of information, and it's like a jigsaw puzzle in your head. You try and fit them together. What else is here? This is probably a little esoteric. Reachable stars. Ethnoastronomy of Eastern North America. This appeals to me because I've been an amateur astronomer for 30 or 35 years, and this talks about constellations as seen by the First Nations. Combined with some of the Ojibwe language lessons I learned, I'm trying to think of the specific reference, but there was something in my own family history. My mom was reading a story of one of our pioneer ancestors, and he would talked about seeing the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, and talked about how it was just coming above the tree line, and they talked a little bit about the weather. And I said, hey, we weren't quite sure where his cabin was. We had an idea on the road. And I said, that when he wrote that story, he didn't date it, but I said we could date it. Yeah. Any of you now who are watching on a computer, you can even get them free of charge. You can go get an astronomy program that tells you where the moon and stars and everything is. Some of them are paid, some of them are free. And what you can do is you can punch in any location on Earth, and you can say, show me what the sky looked like, 10,000 years ago or 20 years ago. So what you can do is you can stop and say, okay, these are pine trees, maybe they're 100 feet high. So that means the Pleiades had to be 20 degrees above the horizon, and it was shortly after sunset. So you can say, okay, where are the Pleiades seen from southwestern Ontario at that time, that day? And so you can narrow down the date within a week or two, and maybe even the rough location, just from this offhand mention that he made of seeing the Pleiades. So again, when you get into the burial grounds, how that relates is a lot of people will say, gee, was Stonehenge built around astronomical alignment? Of course it was. What else did they have it to build around? I mean, the stars were there, the same, the stars were eternal. So just as graveyards were built around, the rising sun, where graves are always built facing the east, unless you were a bad person, then they would turn you around and face you the west. Or if you were First Nations, you're always very facing the west, because when you die and you go on the journey, you follow the sun. So, was the person who was buried, let's say an archaeologist digs up a grave and they find somebody who's buried facing the west, was that because they were, quote, a bad person, or because they were First Nations? So all these little clues start coming in, and you almost have to make like a list and put them all down. But the lack of a central archive in London, and the lack of centralized records, wills are a huge problem here in Ontario. There's no central registry of wills. Some countries around the world, some provinces, some states, in order for a will to be legal, it has to be put into a central registry. Every one of you here living right now, every night of the week, you could write a new will and it would be legal. And where's the record of that? So there's going to be the problem. Then you combine it with what there was a university professor, not myself, said that we are creating a digital dark age. We're putting records, and the example here I can use with you is, how many of you have a floppy disk reader on your computer right now? How many of you have records on floppy disk or on reel-to-reel tape? We're probably getting to the point, I have some people who say to me, do you have the information on a USB drive? Yeah, and they say, oh, that's only USB 2. I'm using USB 3, or I'm using Thunderbolt or something. So the stuff changes so fast. And then I go back to what my mom says, every time history changes hands, it changes or we lose something. That's actually true for computers. They found that out. The example I heard is there was a version of AutoCAD, and I forget what version it was, and this might have been 10, 15 years ago. So what happened is AutoCAD is what you use to design homes and automobiles and engines and stuff. What they did is somebody noticed that there was one line, I forget, it was a very thin line, it became a very thin dotted line. And somebody said, well, if that's the only change, what difference does it make? And the guy says, well, if you're designing the interior of a nuclear reactor for, an atomic submarine, it makes a big difference what that little thin and dotted line is. But it's not so much the thin or dotted line, it's the repetition of mistakes over and over and over again. So you can't trust things. The other thing I want to point out is the change in records, where you really got to be careful. One of the things I've learned, several things I've learned, I was telling you about oral history of First Nations. One of the big problems we have too with the interpretation is that the worldview of First Nations is totally different from the Western view. And Western view, I'm even referring to perhaps people from Middle East or Asia. First of all, in First Nations, time is seen as circular, not as linear. We see our lives as linear. You're born, you live, you die. In First Nations, time is circular. Time folds back on itself. So, for example, in Ojibwe, there's no word for goodbye. It's until we see you again. Another example is how the language is structured. English, like many other languages, is mostly nouns. There's a word for everything. And so 80% of English is nouns, about 20% is verbs. In First Nations languages, about 80 to 90% of the words are verbs, only 10 to 20% are nouns. And what happens is that, for example, there would have been no original word for a dentist. So if you ask somebody to say, what's the Ojibwe name for dentist? They might say, man who pulls teeth, or woman who cleans your teeth. So you might get 5 or 6 different answers, and they're all correct because they're describing what the person does, and that's the name. Your name is what you are, what you do. And it becomes extremely difficult to translate that. And to give you one of the biggest examples of this, if you Google the word Ojibwe, it'll come up meaning puckered shoe or puckered moccasin. And that's not true. According to the elders themselves, Ojibwe is actually a word that means O-G-E, be gay, if if I pronounce it correctly, which means people who have a written history, a written language. But the words get corrupted. For example, Chippewa is a German translation of the word Ojibwe, or O-G-E-B-G-A. And I asked some of the elders how that happened. He says, we don't understand the Germans either, so we don't know how they figured that one out. So when you're translating old First Nations records and how they talk, and you're reading pioneer accounts of what they're translating, they're hearing certain words and they're hearing them wrong, and they're hearing them differently. And the other thing too is in many First Nations languages, certain letters don't exist. There's no R, for example, in Ojibwe. So Barry becomes Banny. And so Banny might mean something totally different to somebody who's French or English. So once you start learning more and more about how languages and words and how things are described, you start, it adds again more and more pieces to the puzzle. Any questions?
Yeah, actually, Sheila had a question.
Sure.
We missed this one earlier. It's my fault. She said when they refer to paupers' graves, does that imply that the person was buried by the city?
Yeah, usually it does. Now, it might not be just the city. Here's the problem. Yeah, it would have been like a burial. It might have been a burial that was done by church or community too, where nobody had any money. That's definitely true. Now, some of this would have been done by the police department, but again, the records are lost. I'll give you an example of what would have been a beautiful source of records. When the police station here in London was shut down and moved, the new police station was built over here near me in 1972. The chief at that time ordered all the old records to be taken to the city dump and burnt. And they were. A few logbooks and a few other things were saved. But all those police records going back to the founding of London were destroyed and burnt on purpose. Everything was lost. And that's where you probably would have found lots of good information about paupers' burials. I'll give you an example where it kind of hurts not to have that. There was 4 Catholic cemeteries in the city of London. First one was at the Basilica. There were burials there, or is it 3? No, 3, pardon me. And second burial ground was on Hamilton Road where Ealing is, goes down to Vauxhall Park. But the problem is, that cemetery existed from 1850 to 1857. There's nothing in the records up at the archives anywhere to say why it was shut down and moved to St. Peter's. We do know some of the graves are moved to St. Peter's, but I have a big issue with that too, because when I walk around where graves have been moved to Mount Pleasant, there's a pattern. When I walk around and I see where graves are moved to Woodland, there's a pattern. There's a bit of a pattern at St. Peter's, but there's too many very old graves that are just out of sync, that don't match each other, that don't fit. When you're researching graves in a cemetery, whether they're pauper graves or anything, usually groups are buried together. Not always, but usually groups are buried together. Even to this day this happens. You'll have a section, if you go out to the different cemeteries, there'll be a Russian Orthodox section in Mount Pleasant. At St. Peter's, there'll be a Polish section. It's not called the Polish section, but the names are all Polish. No World War II Polish veterans there. So unofficially, there's sections in all cemeteries. And you can follow these patterns and these groupings. And St. Peter's, it doesn't fit. Now, what happened is after this Catholic cemetery was moved from Vauxhall Park, there are reports, including Dr. Seaborn's book, that that land was used as a pauper's grave. But I can't find who operated it, for how long, or any of that information at all. Nobody seems to have anything like that. So for somebody like me, it's frustrating. And then you go up to St. Peter's and I see that graves are out of sync, don't match, and I go, that doesn't make sense. And the reason I also think St. Peter's is much older than they say, than anybody has a record, is the Grove Cemetery, which is farther out here on Street, closer to the airport, is officially dated 1826. So I think St. Peter's Cemetery was originally an old pioneer cemetery that goes back to 1826 or earlier and was used as a Catholic cemetery. But why, nobody knows. Next question.
There's another one here, and you may have touched on this already. It says, is there anything significant or unique about First Nations burial or burial sites? I don't know if you wanted to add anything to what you were speaking to already.
Depends who the burials were. there's a lot of difference between the First Nations. That they're not a homogenous group. The religious beliefs and the practices, they varied a lot. They varied a lot, not varied a lot, varied a lot. So it depends on who you're dealing with. Some of them would have put the bodies, on the platforms for a number of years, and then they gathered the graves and they made an ossuary, put the bones together. Some of them were buried more European style. That's maybe not the right way to say it. And then there's burial mounds. If you look at the mound builders, we had mounds here in southwestern Ontario, not as many. And then, so it really depends on the group that you're dealing with, because there's a lot of variation between the burials. And some of them would have been well marked. I think some of them were well marked in the day. And like I said, I think some of them were co-opted too. The First Nations, what made a good burial ground for First Nations made a good burial ground for the early pioneers. So I'm totally convinced that some of them were the same thing, but how do you ever prove it nowadays? I mean, tell you how bad some records were. Some people, my mom tells me my aunt used to be, when she was alive, looked after cemetery records, and she would just write out records on her kitchen table and then send them into the township. And my mom asked her, said, how do the guys know, where the graves are? And she says, oh, they just take the rods out and do rodding. And rodding is where you take great big long iron rods and you pound them into the ground and you see if you hit a casket. And they go, oh, there's a casket. Let's go over 2 feet. Yep, there's one. Okay, nothing here, so we can bury here. So that's how bad some of these old records were. But in terms of the First Nations, if you really want to see the difference in First Nations, how cool a difference it is, if you ever get a chance, go see the main cemetery in Walpole Island, because some of the graves are flat and green and they look like, what I call Western graves. And then some of the graves are raised mounds and they're covered with tons of stuff. Everything from candles to teddy bears to, dream catchers, you name it. And you get to see the things there. Speaking of First Nations burial ground, while they're very respectful of the dead, sometimes they don't know themselves. There's a Catholic cemetery on the peak of Walpole Island. I may have relatives in that, and where the mission was before it was burned down. But unfortunately, there's no records left, and the stones that are there are they were soft white marble, and they've all been worn away from time. So there you go.
Well, Joe, I just wanted to thank you. I think we've hit pretty much the end of our time, I believe. I wanted to mention, because the kind of the general theme that we're hearing is that a lot of these records are either lost or are hard to find. I know on behalf of our branch of Ontario Ancestors, we've actually initiated some talks with Woodland Cemetery anyway. Sheila and I actually went in and were talking to them about having a look at their records that they have and seeing about digitizing them. So, we're trying to do our part to get some of that stuff that is in old books, at least digitized and indexed, so that we can provide that information in some way down the road. So.
Yeah, well, good luck, and try and then even here in London, you're going to have a hard time in some places. Like, for example, all of the official old records for St. Peter's Cemetery are actually down in an archives down in Windsor, so you can't even access them here in London. But Woodland, on the other hand, they do a really good job of, they won't let you in to see the records because they don't want you ripping pages or something, but they do a really good job, especially with the archaeologists.
Fantastic. Sheila, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Joe, this has been a fascinating talk. You have so much knowledge, and I hope that you're writing this down somewhere in your own oral history, especially with your Ojibwe heritage. But I just wanted to also reiterate your comment that perhaps there are some City of London folks here attending tonight, and maybe this would be a great plug for the City of London to finally make some moves to having an archive. It's actually embarrassing to people in the genealogical and historical areas to have to tell people who are researching here that there is no archives for a city this size. I'm very upset that some efforts some years ago did not happen, and it is very sad that all of these records are lost or unknown where they are. And so if we can put a plug for that, that would be really great.
Well, you know, there's a running joke here that the reason we don't have an archives is every time they hire somebody to open up an archives, they dig up too much dirt. They got to get rid of them too quick.
I think that's I think that's about it. So just a reminder that the recording of this will be available afterwards for anybody that does want to rewatch it, or I suppose you could share it as well. Just use the link that we had provided in the confirmation email. I think I sent it out by email earlier this evening as well. And also watch your inbox for a survey, and we'd very much appreciate you having a look at that survey and filling it out for us, because it does help us with our programming going forward. Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you very much, Joe, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Joe.
Well, maybe
on behalf of the branch and the Historical Society, we really appreciate this, and I want to talk to you about it. Contact.
Well, maybe next. I am keeping a COVID-19 journal, and I'm putting entries in almost every day since March 18th, and printed out, it's about 1.5 inches thick already. So there you go, for the future.
And thanks to all the attendees that have come out tonight, and we hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll see you next time as well.